Okay, well, hey everybody. Super excited to have Dr. Matthew Thomas with us. He's an awesome thinker on the subject of Paul, early patristics, and he's written a fabulous book called Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception. And I think I read this book in like a matter of 5 days or something, or it was Christmas week is what it was. And I had been wanting to get my hand on it for quite a while. And then, so I finally got it it was last Christmas. So anyway, super pumped to read it because there's so much gold in it. I like how several of the endorsers described it. Well, yeah, so N.T. Wright calls it theologically explosive. I really like that because it's got a lot of fun stuff to deal with. So anyway, hey, Matt, or Matthew, you go by Matthew, right?
I go whatever you can call me whatever you want. You can call me Tina.
Okay.
Like today, you're the boss here. This is your podcast.
Oh, okay, yeah, gotcha. Well, I'll just call you Matthew. Your given name. It's a good disciple name. I happen to like the name personally, so
I think it's a fine name. I think our parents really onto something.
I totally agree. So just real quick, I want to say something about just my takeaway from the book. We were just talking about this a moment ago, Matthew, because I couldn't find it, but you quickly helped me find it. It's a fun observation on page 280. Was it 280? Yeah, 280, footnote 17. So this tells you how much of a nerd I am because I just honed in on this. But so there's so many good things in this book, of course, and we'll talk about it, of course, I'm sure through the conversation. But there was one bit here as you were talking about, just the question of what does Paul mean by the works of the law, and how did that, how is that understood by the earliest followers of Jesus? You know, those who lived not too long after Paul, right? And you, of course, were comparing their views with people like Luther and Calvin, and of course some modern writers such as Wright and Doug Moo and so forth. But you make this interesting observation in this footnote that this is just a quote. You say, quote, "It is significant that both Luther and Calvin had little to no access to patristic sources prior to Irenaeus." And that is very, very significant, I think, because you have a whole, at least for Luther and Calvin, you have a whole body of literature prior to Irenaeus that just kind of went neglected. And the thing that is curious here is what would have happened had they had access to those sources. And these are the sources that you use in your book, right? So I don't know, do you think there was a lot that they would have changed? Would they have stood their ground, or would they have been okay with everything they read and everything that Luther and Calvin said? Was it consistent with those early interpreters of Paul? I don't know. What say you?
Gosh, it's a great question. And it's actually, so first off, thanks for having me. I really enjoy this. Second off, I love that you love this question, because it's a question that I love too. And I love it because I don't have a fantastic answer to it. It's one of the things that I think about a lot. And, hopefully for some of your listeners, I guess you can say when it comes to Luther and Calvin, I'm an enthusiast for reading them. And I think that they're really important figures, but I'm not sort of a standalone, Luther or Calvin expert. And so it's possible that you're going to have listeners who are even more expert than I. And it's actually, I've asked a number of, especially Calvin experts on this to kind of get their thoughts. When it comes to Luther's interesting because he does not, so I guess you could say the fathers being against his own position on a given question is not something that really seems to dissuade him a whole lot. And he's quite open with how in his own life he had to wrestle with this a lot. He had to wrestle with the sense that I'm going against what is the established church teaching, which has the fathers as its basis. But it is something that he talks about. Hey, I kind of overcame this, and you need to overcome this too if you're going to hang on to the true gospel. And so I was just reading some Luther earlier. I think this is in he does this in a few places. It's one of the interesting spots is in his lectures on Genesis, for example. It's really interesting when he goes and he talks about Noah and Noah's Ark, because there's something that personally hits him really, I think hits home for him in reading this. And so this is one difference on Genesis 6, 9, and 10. So he says, the wretched papists assail us today with this one argument, saying, do you think that all the fathers were in error? It is indeed painful to maintain this, especially about the better ones, Augustine, Ambrose, Bernard, and that entire company of excellent men who ruled the church by the word, who have been adorned with the distinction and lofty name church, and for whose labors we have both praise and admiration. But surely Noah himself encountered a hardship no smaller in the fact that although he alone was declared to be righteous and blameless, the sons of men claimed the name church for themselves too. And so you see, what's he doing here? Well, he's comparing himself to Noah. And he says, the same way that Noah was the only one that was right in this, in his own generation, his own period. And this meant basically condemning everybody else to error. There's something that's deeply resonant here for Luther, but something that he's willing to go and stand on to say, no, I think that the fathers are in error. It doesn't mean that he thinks the fathers are in error all the time, but he also is clear that he thinks his own era, so his own period, is one where the gospel is now being brought to a truer light than it has in any age sort of since the apostles. And so, more so than the time of Augustine, more so than the time of, Jerome, et cetera. And so go ahead.
I was just going to interject real quick. So in some instances, is it the case that Luther sounds more like, less like a reformer and more of a former, if that makes sense?
More of a former.
Yeah. Is that fair?
It's hard to say. Part of the difficulty is that Luther's instincts and his principles sometimes seem like they run into each other. This is one of the things where, Luther, for everything that he says, particularly in this area in relation to justification, understanding of how faith and works relate to each other. This doesn't mean that he's not going to still appeal to the fathers elsewhere on other questions where he holds, he thinks that they're right. And so this is one of the things that, I remember reading his, it's a brief confession concerning the Holy Sacrament, which he writes in 1545. So the last he dies in 1546, so year before he goes and dies. And it's really interesting because he's basically writing against the sacramentarians, so anybody who doesn't hold to the real presence in the Eucharist. And he's writing towards, the Zwinglians and the Swiss, so the Reform folks. And it's really interesting hearing Calvin's, reaction to all this as well. It's just fascinating, just kind of back and forth that's there. And it's interesting because in that treatise, it just kind of seems like the orthodoxy that's been established throughout, the history of the church is just unassailable. How could you possibly go and, question it? And from his standpoint, what what the sacramentarians are doing is it's putting them on the same level as, Arius or Nestorius or Marcion or any of the other great heretics who went against what, the established teaching and practice of the church was up to that point. They're going and doing the same thing, by denying the real presence. And it's quite vivid, colorful language. It's not, I wouldn't say it's the friendliest of Luther's writings. And you can see here, as you're going through, you think to yourself, it seems as though this sits in tension with some of his principles elsewhere, because the obvious rejoinder to Luther from a Protestant standpoint would be to say, hey, you're the guy who did the exact same thing as far as standing against the church, standing against the fathers. on this, on this topic, on the one that you identify as front and center. If that's the case, if you can go and do that, on, the article in which the church stands or falls, why is it that we are inconsistent with your principles to go into to challenge what is received orthodoxy in this case when it comes to the sacrament? And I think that I'm not a depth psychologist. I don't know anything, but just I guess you could say that kind of the inner sort of pastor and sort of wonders if part of why Luther gets really angry at his fellow Protestants in these kinds of situations is the frustration of sort of having some of his own principles and own example used against him and used to go in directions that he is absolutely confident is the wrong direction, but being unable to go and to construct arguments that are really going to be cogent to his audiences, because there's a sense in which they're so similar in what they're doing. So so that's a longer answer for Luther as far as whether that makes him a former or a reformer. It's hard to say. I don't want to be I don't want to be overly kind of Luther negative, because I think that there are things. There's a really good book I have on my desk here. It's by Louis Bouillet. It's called The Spirit and Forms of Protestantism. It's a really interesting book because it's written by a former Lutheran pastor who becomes a Catholic priest and then goes and writes this book called The Spirit and Forms of Protestantism, which basically says, look, on his central ideas, Luther was right. And if you don't believe them, if you don't hold to Luther's central ideas, you're not just a bad Protestant, you're a bad Catholic. The central affirmations of Luther are just universal Christian truths. And he makes this really powerful case for it. And so even though Luther can be quite radical in certain areas, Bouillet gets to those things in the end of the book and everything. He does a really good job of showing the things that Luther was reacting against in his day were things that should be reacted against, that any good Christian, whatever sort of, kind of background you are, should react against. The question is, what do you go and put in its place? And some of the challenges that Luther faces, not all, or not even really most Protestants had the same ideas as he did as far as what you should go and put in its place. So that's part of the difficulty. Anyway, former, reformer, I don't really know. If some of it I think depends on what day of the week it is and what topic you're on.
Yeah.
So that's maybe I'll finish Luther, and then if it's okay, I'll go to Calvin real quick to answer.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah.
All right. So with Calvin, it's interesting because this is one of those areas where in reading Calvin, my own sense is that his theological instincts are not precisely the same as Luther's. In that, while Luther you can find all kinds of funny, really colorful Luther quotes where he just kind of tosses all the fathers out and says, the Turks and the Jews knew better than the fathers. There's all sorts of so what strikes us as pretty wild stuff. Calvin is much more reticent to do that. You can find a couple of places where he makes comments that are not dissimilar. There's a famous one in his commentary on First Corinthians in chapter 3. I think around verse 15, where he has some similar comments there, but they're pretty few and far between. And he, in a number of places in his writings, he talks about what his aims are theologically, and how what he sees his project is doing is to be a restoration to the purer period. He talks generally about the first 500 years of the church as a golden age, and it's interesting because he even kind of lays down the gauntlet in a sense when he's going back and forth with Bishop Sadelet and the famous kind of debate that they have, and says this is the standard. We're just trying to go and to restore the church to this prior age, to the age of the fathers, which, you know, you guys have all gone and messed up with all your medieval creations and everything. And so he's willing to allow that, at least at points, he's willing to allow that to be the grounds on which you're going to go into debate. When it comes to the specific issue that we're looking at, so the specific issue in relation to justification, this is an area where it would seem that his principles stand in tension with his own positions, the positions that he himself holds to from reading Paul, what he thinks is correct in reading Paul. He is pretty forthright that they're quite different from what the fathers go and say. And it's not the only issue where he goes and does this. He does this on the question of free will also. If you read in book 2 of the Institutes, in the first 5 chapters, you know, he's pretty dismissive to the entire Eastern tradition, and then he says it's really only Augustine who goes and gets this, and he goes and proceeds to kind of correct Augustine some as well. So it's not the only place where you're going to find something like this, but it is striking. It's not something that seems consistent with his own principles, or something that he seems entirely comfortable with. And so this is actually how my own project in this got started, was because I had read a lot of Calvin for J.I. Packer, and in doing so, I had gotten used to the way that Calvin goes and argues. So then when I was reading his Romans commentary in Romans 3:20, where it says it's a matter of doubt even among the learned what the works of the law mean. That's what I start the book with, that, because that's where this project started. And he goes and says, you know, the addition of the word law caused, you know, some of the fathers, so Origen, Chrysostom, Jerome, to say that this is talking about, you know, the ceremonies of the Jewish law. And then he goes and says, I'm not unaware that Augustine has a different position from my own. Then he says, here's what Augustine's position is. Here's why this is wrong. And then here's my own position. And you think to yourself, that's really interesting, because that does not seem to be consistent with the principles that he articulates elsewhere, as far as what his own project is about and what he's, you know, what he's doing. It's, you know, he presents this project as, you know, returning to the fathers, not correcting the fathers. So there's, what do you do then? Well, if this is, you know, if Calvin had access to sources, you know, prior to Origen, which for both Luther and Calvin, there wasn't a whole lot of really good textual material available to them. What they did have, you know, letters of Ignatius, etc., was uncertain in a number of different recensions and everything. What would Calvin do with this kind of material, and seeing, you know, the way that basically what Origen and Chrysostom and Jerome are saying, how this isn't just something that they've made up, but this seems as though it's pretty consistent with the understanding of Paul that goes back to his own age and, you know, the decades and the couple of centuries, you know, following. What would Calvin do with that? And that's honestly, I mean, Matt, you could try to answer this for me. I don't know, because you know, what do you do in life when your principles and then your own positions come in tension? I honestly, I go back and forth. I'll be reading one place in Calvin and I'll think to myself, I really think that this would, if he's being consistent with his principles, I think that he would really take this seriously. And there's other days where I think that a little less. And so anyway, you can sort this all out for us.
Oh, I have not. Yeah, I'm not the guy to do that.
You can sort all this out for us.
Yeah, I find Calvin very interesting, because I think he's a very careful reader of Scripture, and I think you do get this sense that he's really trying to follow the train of thought. And the thing interesting about the Reformers, whether Luther or just anybody, Luther, Calvin, Augustine, is that we have this tendency to put them on a pedestal, and we're genuinely shocked when they're not consistent with themselves, or they say something that we're not comfortable with, only later on to refute it. Or, I don't know, but they're very human. And I think it's probably, at the end of the day, it's not real surprising that we would find some inconsistencies in both of them. The interesting thing for me is the nature of the inconsistencies, or just the nature of his disputes with Calvin's dispute with Augustine on 320, or the commentary at Romans 3:20.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get to that, though, because I really want to get to that,
Yeah.
because I have some really interesting questions. Because Calvin seems to say some interesting things in Romans 2 about works and the final judgment, and then he says some things in Romans 3 that I don't know. I'm not a Calvin scholar, so I don't know how to make sense of it. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. So if we can, one thing, maybe we can just back up and just get into Paul for a moment.
Sure.
Romans is kind of where the battle lines are always drawn. So when I was cutting my own theological teeth, I was influenced by a lot of really smart thinkers, and authors and scholars and so forth. But part of what I came to believe initially, before I started like studying this really in depth, is that I had this opinion or this prejudgment of Paul that he always hated the idea of works, and it was all about faith in Jesus, right? I was sort of under the impression that there was this sort of allergy to works in Paul, and there are times though when as I went into seminary and I was reading Paul a little bit closer than I ever had before, I began to see that okay, he's not he doesn't have as much of an allergy to works as I initially thought or prejudged him to think. Yeah. So you read Romans 2, he has some things to say about works. And I know that Romans 2, N.T. Wright calls it the joker of the pack, but Romans 2 is hotly debated. But at least on my reading and what I find convincing, and I may not be right, but on my reading, he says some positive things about works. And not to mention when you get into the Gospels too, but anyway, just to get back to Paul seems to have some positive things to say about works. And even you taking the word faith, when you sign up for elementary Greek and intermediate Greek, you learn, things about Greek words. The Greek word, for faith, pistis, which is, something Paul uses a lot. It within its semantic range could be not just faith, but faithfulness, right? Matthew Bates, has his book on salvation by allegiance alone. I read that a while back, and so there's lots of debate about that. So, but I think Bates is essentially right about faith there. But if that's the case, then what do we make? Then how do we make sense of justification? With respect to works, because there are some places, namely in Romans 3:20 we mentioned, where Paul says you're not justified by works of the law, and of course that opens up the can of worms. So I'm just curious, given that tension, if Paul does have positive things to say about faith in about works in Romans 2, given and secondly, given that pistis can mean faithfulness, allegiance, or whatever. How do we square that with his negative comments about works of the law, 3:20 in places? How do we parse all this out, and how has it been parsed out by folks like Augustine, Luther, and Calvin?
Yeah. Well, but that's probably just one question there. I'll just give short answer.
Go right ahead.
It's like, hey, so if you can figure out the Bible for me.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, here, I'll do a short stat with this. I think if you're looking within Paul, and this is within the early patristic sources as well. I talked about this in the beginning of the book in the new preface, how initial justification, so being brought into relationship with God and receiving the forgiveness of sins and receiving God's justifying grace, something that comes apart from anything at all. And I think that there's different ways of interpreting Romans 4, and I think that there's a number of good ways of doing it. However you go and do it, I mean, I think that you got to recognize that Abraham was not, he was not a mistates, in the sense that he's not a hired laborer. It's not as though God goes and says, hey, I got a bunch of work for you to do, and if you do all this work, I'm going to go and I'm going to give you this reward. And, then he goes and gives them the wage at the end of the day, etc. That's not the way that Abraham is called. Abraham he's the friend of God. And part of being the friend of God is that that relationship or friendship is something that God goes and starts. For me, I've found the work of people like David De Silva and John Barclay just be really, really helpful here in looking at, within that cultural context, what's the kind of distinction between a grace-based relationship and a wage-based relationship. What's how does that all work? Well, wage-based relationship is just kind of what I described. There's no real relationship that's required or implied in anything like that. So that's the end of the story. And Paul says, was that Abraham's story? Is that what happened? And I think what he's saying in Romans 4 is no, it's absolutely not what happened. The way that this worked is that God went and called Abraham. He called him, and he didn't. From what we know, there's no prior anything. When he's in Ur of the Chaldeans, anything. We just know that God went and called him, and he gave him this. Gave him his grace, and that Abraham went and responded to it. And he responded with faith, which is interesting. The word faith, and the way this can mean fidelity, trust. Fill in the blank. Within the the Greco-Roman cultural context, that's the way that these kind of patronage relationships work, where you have somebody who goes and gives a gift to somebody, goes and gives grace to somebody, and the proper response to that is faith. It's fidelity. It's this kind of loyalty. And so I think I think a lot of what Matt Bates is saying here is really good and really helpful, and helps us to return to I guess you could say a first century context for understanding how these things go and work, rather than just sort of projecting whatever other categories we might think of, whether the 21st century categories or 16th century or 31st century. I don't know if anybody is clairvoyant and can see what's going to happen in the future. I mean, I think it's really good and really helpful. That faith, then, that loyalty, that response is itself consequential. Whether or not you have faith, whether you don't have faith, whether you respond to this grace with faith, with the kind of loyalty and fidelity that is the proper response to the gift, that's consequential one way or the other. But that kind of faith and loyalty is not what goes and gets the ball rolling. What gets the ball rolling is the giver. That's where it comes from. And so in that sense, there's no, whether we're talking about works of the law, whether we're talking about good works in general, anything like that, there's nothing that goes on our end that elicits God's grace, that elicits God going and saying, hey, I'm going to go, I guess you got it straight now without me, and so now you can go. Here's your present, here's the pony or whatever the present was that you wanted. It doesn't work that way. And that's part of, you can map that actually on, you talked about some of the difficulty in saying, kind of if you, in applying a kind of strict faith alone paradigm to the Gospels, for example. But there's actually something that is really, if you understand in this way, there's something that works really well with Jesus's own ministry here. If you understand that there's no prerequisite that Jesus is requiring from people to receive his grace and to receive, the grace of repentance and renewal and restoration. That this is something that he goes and gives freely while we are still sinners. That maps onto why it is that you have the tax collectors and prostitutes and the fishermen who probably aren't the most the very most pious guys and all of Galilee, why they are the ones who are responding, and those who are the religious authorities, etc., are often lukewarm at best, and not infrequently worse than lukewarm. And so that ties in really well. But then there's also, in Jesus' own ministry and the way he teaches and preaches, you always have that sense of contingency. You always have that sense of go and sin no more lest something worse happen to you. And I think that when we understand that first century context for how, how grace works, how those kinds of relationship works, how this grace-based relationship actually serves to go and to make it creates a relationship rather than it's just a transactional kind of thing. And that's what Paul is saying. God made Abraham his friend, and he said, I'm going to give you many descendants. What does it mean to have many descendants? Well, this is going to be many people who have a similar kind of relationship to God that Abraham had, where he receives his grace, and there's not just going to be one person who's called the friend of God, but there's going to be lots and lots of people who are his seed who are going to be called the friend of God, who are going to, enter into God's friendship in the same kind of way. I think when you get all that contextual stuff, I think it helps a lot, and it helps to perhaps relieve some of the tensions, or at least apparent tensions that we might have elsewhere. Some of which I think, there's a lot. I'm not going to get into all the reasons for kind of where those things come from, because I think that depending on what you're reading tradition we're from, there's really interesting histories for all of those. So I guess I'll pause and I'll hand you the microphone.
No, that's good. That's really good. I like that. So some scholars talk about initial justification, final justification. How is that? How do we make sense of that?
Yeah. I think it's kind of hard to avoid saying something like that. I think it's hard to avoid, saying something like this. I mentioned, in our the little blog entry thing that we did, a few months back. You're talking about that, how you find that within the early sources and early readers of Paul, and then you also it's interesting. This is where it showed up with some controversy recently, is with John Piper and Tom Schreiner, and the distinction between entering into a relationship with God and final salvation, and being with God in heaven, and how Piper makes a really clear distinction between these, and Schreiner does as well in his book. And I think that in so doing, they're consistent with the patristic tradition. They're consistent with how it is that Paul has been read within the early church. And so I think in that sense, I think that there's good precedence for what they're saying. I think on that particular point, it seems to me that there's real tension between what they're saying and what Luther says, for example. And this is perhaps one of the areas, and Luther goes and says as much, when he will sometimes go and he will lump in the Reformed, so the Zwinglians, with the Papists, and just say, they both go, when they say that you have to go and obey, the commandments, they're just doing the same thing. They're saying the same thing that the Papists are saying. So the Papists, the Zwinglians, the Anabaptists, from Luther's standpoint, they all keep making the same mistake. And so this could be an area where for Piper and for Schreiner on one side, that this goes back 500 years to a kind of broader Lutheran Reformed tension that's here. I was looking at this earlier. This is in his commentary on John. This is on John 6:38-39. So this is Luther. This is a sublime article of faith, and it is very hard to believe that Christ can do it and has the command to do it, and that salvation and all eternal bliss are entirely divorced from our works, from the 10 Commandments, and from our happiness. It's at that point, it seems to me that there's real tension between what Luther is putting forward, and then the way that you're going to understand how faith and works go and relate, and kind of initial justification, final justification within the Reformed tradition. I will say that this is one of these areas where just as somebody who just really enjoys learning and wants to understand different traditions as much as possible, I'll say that probably with all of the various, reform, friends and thinkers I've talked to in these areas, it really goes back and forth as far as, whether they think that what people like Piper and Schreiner are saying as far as initial justification, final justification, and there being a real final justification in accordance with works, whether or not this is faithful to the Reformed tradition. And at the end of the day, it just seems to me that it depends on your understanding of the Reformed tradition and which branch of the Reformed tradition you come from, and where that particular branch tends to go into place more weight. Because I've just gotten back and forth responses where, one person will go and say, these guys are absolutely right. This is, the Reformed tradition believes in the necessity of works. And then the next person I talk to says, these guys are completely off the reservation. They're selling out the Reformation, et cetera. And so that's one of those areas where I genuinely, I'm not certain who is the, who's the most, faithful representative here. And I think that some of it probably goes back to tensions within the tradition as well.
So what specifically Calvin, what would have Calvin had done with works?
What would Calvin do with works?
Yeah.
So I'll say here, in this area, any Calvin scholars who are listening, who want to go and critique me, by all means do so. I'm giving you free pass to go for it. This is one of the areas. I think that. So what I was saying here, I think part of why you get different people who both identify as Calvinists, having different views of what it is that Calvin says with regard to works and the necessity of works, and initial justification, final justification, etc. I think that Calvin is not entirely clear on this area. This is just one of those areas where, in my view, I find actually Luther to usually be a little clearer, even if Luther's views seem like they can, be quite extreme as far as, extreme in the sense of, his views being right means that, kind of, the patristic tradition, and then even a lot of his, his own, kind of fellow Protestants are wrong in his area. So extreme in that sense, and kind of, putting him, out, sort of, on his own some. There's at least I think a consistency, or it seems to me, a consistency, with Calvin. I know that he wants to link together justification and sanctification in a way that they're distinct but not separable. They're distinct but not separable. They always go together, and so he tries.
That's his exact. Oh, I'm sorry. That's his exact line in the Institutes. He says, they're separate. They're not separable but distinct. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and so in that sense, what he's doing is not precisely what Luther is doing, and I mean, and I think there's a sense which what Luther says with great frustration in relation to the Zwinglians and kind of the Swiss in general. Would probably apply to what Calvin is doing, and really closely, linking these. And you can't go and have one without the other. But how that all actually works out in his theology, I'll confess, I've never been able to really put those pieces together well. And I think that because there is a lot. I think because there seems to be tension in the principles that Calvin is holding to. It's one of the things where you can see how, for somebody who's within a tradition like this, how it would actually be easy for the whole apparatus to end up being governed by predestination, which you can argue, whether or not Calvin thinks that that's a good thing to do or not a good thing to do. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those who are predestined to election, they're going to be justified. They're going to be sanctified. This is all going to go and happen. And from Calvin's standpoint, that's not a that, that's not an encouragement to laxity or anything like that. But I think that you can see how I guess you could say for, your non-theologian who's going and trying to, get a sense of all these things. It's like, if predestination is in the background anyway, if predestination is really the thing that's governing it, at the end of the day, it's not really about whether you have the works or don't have the works, because you were predestined or not predestined from all eternity. It's pretty easy to see how that could end up sort of overshadowing, and sort of subsuming the conversation as far as how these two things fit together. So honestly, that's maybe the best that I can do. And I myself go and try to talk to people who are, really educated and, within the Reformed tradition as far as how these things fit together. And I just I get different answers from different people pretty frequently. And I think that, if you've, looking, for instance, the stuff with Schreiner and Piper, and then some of the responses, to them, which have been, quite vituperative, you could say. They are, many of them are not exactly friendly. I think that they point to this tension, in Calvin's theology, which doesn't seem to ever be entirely resolved, at least resolved in a way that's intelligible to everybody in the same way.
That's interesting. So for those listening, you're talking about initial justification, final justification. Can you just, for those who may not be familiar with those terms, what is that? What is initial justification and final justification?
Yeah. So some of it has to. I mean, so you're gonna get different views depending on who you're talking to when it comes to what, because this kind of gets at the issue of what is the nature of justification, and everyone is, I think, going to agree that the nature of justification is something where it entails coming into right relationship with God, and that it entails the forgiveness of sins. And so if we're thinking, initial justification, those elements are going to be there. I mean, the question that then goes along with it is, does this also entail a kind of transformation as well? So justification, like an actual change within the human being. And so that there is we in English, we turn into two words, so righteousness and justice, from dikaiosune, or dikaiao, but you just have one Greek root there, and so this could just as easily be translated as righteousization, or some I guess,
which is a great word. Yeah. I tried to make Microsoft Word be okay with righteous. Or I think Mike Bird says dikaiosify or something like that, which is, I like that one.
Yeah, well, Ed Sanders, famously goes and does this, and he says, he uses righteous, or I think it might be righteousized. I forget which one it is, but because he understands, for Paul, he thinks that there is, a real transformational, element to to justification, and in initial justification as well, for Paul. And usually, the end of Romans 5 is the place that people go to this. So just as many were made sinners by Adam, so many will be made righteous, in Christ, which it seems that goes and makes that explicit. Now, that's I guess you could say ecumenically, that's a point of contention, in that you find stuff like that in the early fathers, this transformative understanding of justification. You find that in the in the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, and in some Protestant traditions. Your magisterial Protestant traditions tend to go against this. So again, your Luthers and your Calvins, because that's too closely identifying justification and sanctification, because again, you're thinking, if you're thinking, righteousing or righteousize, whatever, that seems like it's essentially synonymous with sanctification. And then the issue, I think, for both Luther and Calvin, is that this then makes justification in a sense dependent on something that's taking place inside us, instead of something that's strictly outside of us. And so there's you could say there's a tension there, but it's interesting, that question doesn't actually have to be resolved in order to still hold to the initial justification, final justification distinction. Because of course, something like, N.T. Wright even doesn't really hold to justification as transformative. He hangs on to it as a legal, forensic, declaration. But and then but he still has the distinction, which with that, and then final justification, which is the believer before God's judgment seat. So I think Romans 2, 2 Corinthians 5, Romans 14 as well. The kind of all the judgment passages as they go in there, they relate to the believer. That is final justification, which is the outworking of this grace in one's life. And it's interesting how that's the kind of distinction that you seem to find in Piper and Wright in Piper and in Schreiner as well. And so even if there's disagreement, I guess you could say, on the nature of justification, you can still have one holding, to this, to the separation between them. One articulation of this is something that in our little blog thing we did a while back, that I put it on here just because I think it's a helpful little quote. This is from Jerome in his commentary on Galatians. And so he says, "It is of course inquired from this place if faith alone is sufficient for a Christian, and whether he is not cursed who despises the precepts of the gospel. But faith is effective for this, that it justifies those who approach God in their initial believing, if afterwards they remain in justification. However, without works of faith, not works of law, faith is dead. For he who does not believe the commands and those who despise the precepts of the gospel are alike cursed, as the Savior teaches." So you can see the distinction between sort of the initial coming to faith, the initial believing, and then what goes and follows from that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because Wright famously several years ago, he got into what he was saying was very controversial among some of his Protestant friends, because he was saying there's a final justification in accordance with works or something. I forget his exact language there. And yeah. I remember that struck kind of a point of discussion among a lot of folks. And it seems like that language of, or that concept is sort of made its, I don't know, more people are more comfortable with it today, I guess. I don't know. That's my observation, but.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's interesting. So, I mean, when I first got started in all this, just as a student, it was with the back and forth books between Wright and Piper. And this is one of the things that's really interesting, is that what Piper goes and articulates is quite similar actually to Wright on this question, or at least the way that he goes and presents it now. I'm not familiar enough with his work to know if this is kind of always the way that he's put stuff. But if you look at some of his some more recent stuff here, so in justification, faith receives the finished work of Christ performed outside of us and counted as ours, imputed to us. In final salvation at the last judgment, faith is confirmed by the sanctifying fruit it is borne, and we are saved through that fruit and that faith. We are saved through, this is at the final salvation. We're saved through that fruit and that faith.
And this is a quote from what?
This is Piper.
From his The Future of Justification.
This is not from The Future of Justification. I think that this is from this is on Desiring God, from Does God Really Save Us by Faith? I believe it's from that one.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah.
So and then he has similar material that's in his introduction to Tom Schreiner's book as well. I mean, it's interesting that you kind of have to ask the question, because it is so similar to what to what Wright goes and says there. So
yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, I have not read that. I've not read Schreiner's book either, so I'm somewhat unfamiliar with. I'm completely unfamiliar with what's in the book because I haven't read the book. But it's fascinating. So back to Calvin real quick. So in the Institutes we've talked about this. He says that justification, sanctification, they are not separable, but they are distinct. And if I'm not mistaken, It's either there or in his commentary. I mean, I know it's in the commentary. He talks about how, well, no, it may be in the Institutes too. He highlights the differences between him and Augustine on this. I know it's specifically in the Romans 3:20 commentary where he says, look, works have nothing to do with or justification. Paul excludes all works and so forth. And then he says, and I think you mentioned this a moment ago, he says, I'm not blinded by the fact that Augustine differs with me on this. And he separates himself from Augustine on this because Augustine actually believed that God does justify us based on our works, though those works are God's own gift to us. And so he's just, crowning his own gift sort of thing, right? But Calvin pushes back against that and says, yeah, that's not quite right, because essentially he accuses Augustine of bringing too closely together justification and sanctification.
The problem is that Augustine is a Pelagian.
Yeah. Yeah, Augustine's a Pelagian. Yeah, okay. So I mean, it's funny there, actually, in that context. He separates himself from Augustine, but then he kind of rescues Augustine. He says, those who've interpreted him in my modern times, they've corrupted him more, so he sort of just he doesn't really like lambaste Augustine. He just sort of says there's some less pure things in Augustine that the crazy people today seem to exploit and everything. So I thought that was kind of funny. But so that's really interesting, because maybe we can say something about this, is Augustine's idea that we are justified by our works. But it's not the idea of merit in the sense that we might think. It's not us pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's none of that. It's the idea of God just giving us the Spirit, the grace to produce those works over the course of life, I suppose, and then we're rewarded. But then again, that word's all fuzzy, reward, because all God's really doing is rewarding his own work that he's produced in us. And Calvin says, yeah, I'm not on board with that at all, So that's interesting. Does Calvin, you've read much more Calvin than I have, or maybe, let me just ask this question. Does Calvin appeal to any of the fathers to justify his own stance as he distances himself from Augustine? In the commentary, I don't see that, but
it's a good question. So on the particular question that I focus on, so works of the law. And so what is it that Paul is setting in antithesis to faith on the question of justification? This is the area that jumped out to me so much initially, and still jumps out to me, is how I don't know of another place, where he's where he kind of goes so far out on a limb, because he loves studying the fathers. He loves going in and studying the fathers in his favor, and you just don't find this on this particular question. What's really interesting is that the categorization, in a sense, even though I don't think he's trying to go and create categories necessarily, but the way that Calvin goes and frames this in his commentary is basically I found to be really good categories when you go back into the early sources and you're looking in early reception, because he goes and he first distinguishes position from Origen, Jerome, Chrysostom, and then he goes and says, here's the second one, here's Augustine's position, and distinguishes his position. And in my book, what I've done is I've talked about that early position, Origen, Chrysostom, Jerome position as the early perspective, and so the early perspective on works of the law, which focuses on the Torah, and which focuses on the Torah's distinctive practices, which go and make you a part of the Jewish nation, covenant, etc. Which Paul is then sitting in contrast, not with sort of. It's there's not this kind of big blanket kind of works thing, but it's now there's a new covenant. Now we're under Christ's law, and this is the law of Christ, which actually does go and justify. And so what he has ordained in baptism and Eucharist and everything that that he goes and gives this is what goes and actually fulfills the promises that was made to Abraham, which, the Torah and, being Jewish did not go and do. And so that's, you can say, the early perspective, which Calvin goes and summarizes that and saying like, oh, they're focusing on the ceremonies of the Jewish law, which in a sense works in that there's a contrast, between what was set up and what was distinctive to the Mosaic covenant, and then what is set up within the new covenant. And so it does seem as though there's a focus on, I guess you could say on the ceremonies, if you want to say circumcision, Sabbath, food laws, and stuff like that. But nobody's really saying ceremonies in that sense. It's not like there's a kind of a categorization in this early period where that's the focus. That kind of taxonomy is a later, is a later development. So you have that early position. You have the Augustinian position, which, as you identified, is the idea which you see this developing in Augustine, which is not without precedence. It's not like you can't find anybody saying anything like this within the tradition before it, but you're in the Pelagian controversy, you're in a different polemical context. And instead of going and arguing against either Judaizers or Jews themselves who are saying, if you want to be part of God's people, why are you not doing what the scriptures go and say to do? Why are you not circumcised? Why are you not adhering to what it is that Moses has ordained? Instead of arguing against those parties, he's now arguing against Pelagius. And Pelagius, I guess you could say, seems to have a view of humanity's ability to obey the law and to obey what God has ordained, which seems to not sufficiently account for the gravity of sin and the necessity for the transformation that Christ goes and effects in us. I don't want to, you can, when it actually gets to reconstructing Pelagius' arguments and everything like that, a lot of that can be difficult. And so we can just take that as a working sort of definition of what it is that Pelagius is doing. And that's what Augustine is reacting against. And so within that particular context, the way he goes and talks about works of the law is as basically anything that is done apart from God's grace. Any actions whatsoever that are not empowered by God's grace is a work of the law, and it can be this. And this is then set in contrast with what we do that is empowered by God's grace, which is actually justifying, which is actually meritorious, because, as you say, God goes and crowns his own gifts. And so it's not that works themselves don't justify, but it's that without grace, everything is basically futile. We don't have the power to go and to do it. But that you don't have, I guess you could say, the way that, with the sort of the absolute dichotomy with faith and works that you're going to see later in Luther, and then in a different way, but still similar content-wise with Calvin. You don't see that with Augustine. And so when we were talking earlier, you were talking about how, alluding to I think it's McGrath on Augustine, where he talks about for Augustine, it's actually more proper to say that we're justified by love alone, because it's love that really goes and does this. It's that's what really goes and counts in the end. Where Augustine ends up with his theology, that in this way, ends up being quite different from the end point that either Luther or Calvin had, which is why both of them on this particular question expressly distinguish their own positions from the Augustinian position. So anyway,
yeah, that's it. Yeah, there's always, like, at least in the tradition I'm used to, that I was kind of reared in my Christian life early on, was there's kind of this perception that Luther and Calvin, were always on cue with the fathers, right? And they were always in sync with Augustine, especially, And I mean, that's just simply not true. And it's interesting, as I began to read through some of this stuff, I began to notice that and this isn't just merely my interpretation or anybody's interpretation. Like, Calvin actually says, yeah, I'm distancing myself, right? Luther actually says, I'm distancing myself. And in many ways, they're doing their own thing. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to be unfair, because we all do theology within a context, with certain sparring partners. It's always contingent, the way we read scripture is always situational and so forth. I mean, that's another thing. But so I want to be super fair, but we want to be fair too, to say that there's not always continuity between the two, by virtue of what Calvin himself says, and I think that, again, just within my tradition, and I'm just, I reared in a very narrow, particular evangelicalism, right? That probably doesn't know that, right? That I didn't know that, and that's okay. Every tradition has its blind spots, right? That's for sure. But I'm just curious that how that could have been missed, and part of the thing is what's really interesting. I'm just going to make a comment. This is just Matt Halstead's comment. The past 20 years, I mean, we're in the same generation. So I think in our generation, when we were all cutting our theological teeth, we were always reading John Piper, right? We were always reading, there's always those people. And then I'm thankful for that background for sure. But then through the influence of those folks, you have the new Calvinism sort of thing. And at least that's what I'm most familiar with personally. The interesting thing about the new Calvinism, I mean, this is the Matt's observation alone. I don't, you don't have to quote me or anything necessarily, but
I'm writing all of this down. Just
okay. So you know. Well, it is going to go on YouTube, I guess. So anyway. The interesting thing about the new Calvinism is that nobody read Calvin. Like everybody read the commentators. Everybody read Sproul and all those types of folks.
Yeah.
But Calvin, I don't want to say nobody read Calvin, but it was just dabbled into and not really like invested into. And it's such an ironic thing, in my opinion, is why weren't we reading Calvin primarily, and the commentators maybe secondarily? I don't know. It's primary sources are always more difficult. I understand that. And we don't always have access to them, but I don't know. I just think that's interesting. That's why I think Calvin's so much more interesting than I ever thought he was, just because of how he does distance himself from folks. But anyway,
yeah.
Okay, so
you're absolutely right. Sort of C.S. Lewis's guidance that he goes and gives about reading old books, and how actually the real classics are easier to read than any of the commentators upon the classics. And so just go and read old books. That's something I think that everyone would do well to hold to. And I mean, for me, I'll just say from a standpoint of, testimony, I mean, my own life has been so enriched by, reading a great deal of, material from the early church, and, from the Reformation period, from all these different periods. You just, you're able to, I think, develop a real historical, perspective, in a sense of, what in your own time is really solid, and what in your own time is perhaps a bit more ephemeral. And so anyway, I just think just what you're saying is a fantastic advertisement for just hey, just pick up the sources and read them. Like this isn't rocket science. Calvin wasn't writing for rocket scientists. No. It's not. It's always, and these figures that I spend so much time in, people like, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, people like that. Like they're not writing for rocket scientists. They're writing for individual, people, people like you and me, and they're intelligible, I think, for anybody who'll sit down and give them a try. So, yeah.
Do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Just question, another thing I was going to say, kind of a discussion point, is that with Luther, we talked a lot about Calvin, but Luther, and I admit I'm less familiar with Luther than I am with Calvin, but nonetheless, Luther is really interesting too with respect to justification, because if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, he's got a very sacramental view of justification.
Yeah.
And there's a quote that you and we were talking. I don't remember when it was. Was it in the blog,
I think it
or
might
on
have
the
been
phone or something?
a little blog
Okay.
thing. I think probably I was probably ended up on the phone as well. So
Oh, okay, gotcha. Well, you know the quote about baptism, and if Luther thought if you didn't believe in baptism, or if you don't believe in justification, what was it? I forget. Baptism plays a role in justification.
exactly.
Then you don't believe in justification by faith alone. I don't know if you have the quote.
Yeah, I do. I have it right here on MatthewHalstead.com. One of my favorite websites.
Oh, good. That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah. So here, this is the quote that we were talking about. So, if anyone denies here, as the fanatical spirits do today, that righteousness and salvation are granted to an infant as soon as he is baptized, if anyone evades this promise in this way by saying that it becomes valid when a man reaches the use of reason and is able to do good works and to obtain what is set forth in the promise by doing good works, if anyone says that baptism is not a sign of the will of God towards us, but only a mark that distinguishes believers from unbelievers, such a person utterly deprives baptism of salvation and attributes salvation to works. This is what the false apostles and their disciples did in everything.
And I remember you asking the question, you said, when we were talking or whatever, you said, when's the last time you ever heard a Protestant say that?
Oh, yeah.
And this goes to show the discontinuity. And my background, by the way, is Baptist, right? And so we're definitely the ire of Luther, right? So what's interesting is that there is continuity between even my tradition and Luther, of course, but there's a lot of discontinuity between the tradition, the respective traditions. Not just my tradition, but many Protestants. And Luther himself, they wouldn't be able to affirm some of this. Now, the interesting thing that I've thought about is, of course, in the Lutheran mantra, and I don't know if Luther actually said this or if it was just tradition or Lutheranism, a Lutheran type of thing, but justification is the article upon which the church stands or falls, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if that's true, we'll just go with it. And if Luther's conception of justification is true, namely with respect to the quote you just read, then what does that do to just never mind our the Roman Catholic tradition? What about other Protestants of other traditions outside of Luther's tradition? That's really interesting to me. So I mean, there's options. I mean, Luther could be wrong that the article upon which the church stands or falls is not justification, which I don't know any Protestant who really wants to say that, right? At least in my tradition. Or you could say simply that, well, there's a lot of other options. You say, maybe Luther's wrong about baptism. In which case he's wrong about justification. What do we do with that? Am I just thinking crazy here, or is this a legitimate question?
Matt, you trying to get me killed here?
No. Okay, we can edit this out.
No, wait, we're not editing any of this.
Okay.
This is the good stuff, man.
Okay,
this is
good
stuff. This is no, I love death threats. They're So
I don't. Hey, by the way, I wrote something one time, and it was for the Logos blog, the Bible software people.
Yeah.
And I got so many bad emails. I was called an agent of Satan.
Oh, you showed me that.
Did I say that?
Oh yeah, man! And now you're doing your agent of Satan thing again.
I am so getting that email again. So I got so many emails. Anyway,
this response is this is especially for my favorite agent of Satan, Matthew Halstead.
Oh, good, yeah.
I think your observations are, I think they're right on. There's a tension that's here, and if one holds to the Lutheran understanding of baptism as it relates to justification, then there's not really a tension. You kind of go with Luther's understanding of how this all goes and works, and you're not a false apostle. You're just this is you kind of get it all. And it was I was conversation with a Lutheran friend who's actually a guy who read the book I was just kind of chatting with. I think his name is Brian. So Brian, if you're watching this, here's a shout out. And he was saying, because we're talking about this quote, he was saying that, yeah, absolutely. From Luther's standpoint, this is how it works. Is baptism is so central. Like, you can't find somebody who has a higher view of like the significance of what baptism is and what baptism does than Luther does. It's the basis for everything. It's what you appeal back to all the time. And even when you're going to confession in a Lutheran context, it's like, it's kind of that the second and a half sacrament that Lutherans have, where Luther goes down to 3 sacraments and sort of goes to 2 sacraments, but still really wants confession, and it's understood as as an outworking of the renewal of baptism within going to confession. Yet if you hold to a Lutheran understanding of this and what baptism is, how it works, then there's I don't think there's an issue. It is what it is. And I guess I'll also say that in this area, Luther's understanding of the nature of baptism, if we're saying that other areas that in his theology, he might have more, there might be greater discord between his understanding and that of the patristic tradition, for example. On this area, I think that his understanding of baptism is closer to the church fathers, to just traditional Christianity, than what you're going to see in the Reformed tradition, for example, where baptismal regeneration is not something that's held to with consistency, whereas for again the earlier tradition, I think that is something that you just kind of find everywhere. So in this sense, Luther, the way that he basically goes and equates faith with baptism is faith is baptism, and it is, so it's not a it's actually it's really funny. This was a fun little story. When I was doing the PhD Viva for this, I had as one of the examiners was John Barclay, who's I have a tremendous respect for, and who I have just learned a great deal from. And one of the questions that he had was, does it make sense, because the fathers talk so much about the law of Christ, and how the law of Christ is what is binding for us and for everyone now, rather than the law of Moses. And so one of the questions he had was, does it make sense to talk about being justified by the law of Christ? And is that really a penetrating reading of Paul? Is that what he intends to say? And at least from Luther's standpoint, even though he wouldn't use his precise words, the answer would be yes. Because if you think of the law of Christ as Christ's ordinances, do Christ's ordinances go and justify? I.e., does baptism justify? If this is, circumcision didn't justify, did his baptism justify? Yes, it absolutely goes and does this. And so this understanding of baptism is one of the areas where Luther, I think, is more traditional in his theology. The difficulty, I think, is the variance between Luther and, I think, most Protestants who have followed from Luther, and there is a real tension there, and there's probably different ways of resolving that. I think that you're right that there's a risk of falling into what seems to be a kind of arbitrariness, to go and to say, hey, this is the guy who kind of rediscovered the gospel by saying that here's, he rediscovered the center of the Christian faith. And when you actually go in to see, what he says about it, oh, but he was wrong. Like, he didn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
Or when you hear,
that's a good point.
Or when you hear him, saying things about how it actually goes and works, and he's giving these condemnations and saying that this is what this is what a false apostle does. And you're looking at this and you're like, oh boy, that would be what I would do. That sounds like the things that he would
me.
Yeah, totally. Look,
yeah.
there's there's a real tension there, and I think that the kind of step one is to take these figures seriously. Whether it's Luther, whether it's Calvin, whether it's who. I guess you could say kind of, I mean, we're only talking about these figures, but there are a lot of, really important, influential figures in this period. I think the first step is to actually really take them seriously and take their views seriously. And, to see, like, do I think that this is true? Do I not think that this is true? And there's certainly, from a reform standpoint, you can go and say, yeah, Luther was a guy who got some things quite right and did a lot of things well, and there's other areas where he was deeply confused, and instead this other guy is right, or fill in the blank. And so that's one way of engaging with the question, kind of the issue that's there. What I think helps no one is to basically hold to these kind of this sort of vague pious notions that, like, whatever kind of me and my friends happen to believe is what these sort of great heroes of the faith who fill in the blank, whether Luther, Calvin, Augustine, whoever, this is exactly their own positions. And you don't actually do them you don't show them the charity of actually reading their writings to hear what they have to say. Because that's the thing, is if you regard any of these figures, which again, we've been focusing on these three, and I hope that my work is encouragement to really expand, because there's so many of the fathers. There's some, I mean, whether you're a Chrysostom guy, like Calvin himself was. Calvin loved Chrysostom, or fill in the blank. There's so many of these figures. But if you just take these three and you really regard them as these heroes of the faith, then that would seem to imply that we should let them go and speak into our own faith and our own practice, and we should look to them as people who can and should and will correct us, more than and not that it should be the other way around. Like, hey, you're a hero of the faith, I'm some sort of Joe Schmo guy, but I'm going to look at myself as the person who has all the answers on this, and won't even bother to open up any of your writings. That to me, it seems to me that if we regard these people as as heroes of the faith, that is the only real approach to have to them, is to really engage them, to place ourselves at their feet and to take them really seriously. And if we don't do that, then I think it's a signal that we're paying them lip service, but we don't actually mean what we're saying, which is unfortunate, because we really should mean these things. Because we really are just, I'm just kind of Joe Schmo guy. Maybe you're not, but I want to learn from these heroes of the faith. I want to be discipled by them. I want my own faith and practice to be enriched by kind of the great cloud of witnesses that's come before us. And I don't have any illusion as far as standing on the shoulders of giants, etc. Because I just want to climb up to their ankles, basically. And even that goes and takes work. It's not something that happens automatically, but the work is worthwhile. It really is. And there's no substitute for really going and reading the stuff for yourself. So
that's good.
Yeah. So just like your buddy Luther would say, man, ad fontes, you gotta actually take this stuff up and do it yourself. You can't just sort of sit on the sidelines. It doesn't do justice to anybody that way.
So two quick things here. We could wrap it up, but I have a real heart for, and it's sad that this is like a curse word almost, but I have a ecumenical sort of heart, and I
believe you.
I know.
Terrible.
It kind of is.
Cut the tape.
Right. I think it's important, and I was really challenged on this by a professor years ago when I first went to grad school. He was a believer, and and
Hope he still is a believer.
oh yeah, he is. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
As far as I know. But
there's this great apostate professor I had in this.
That's right. Yeah, he's a heretic now, but greatly influential. He was, yeah, it was at a state school when I first went to grad school. I initially wanted to just teach philosophy, and then I went to grad school, and then I don't know, I started slowly thinking I need to do theology more. So anyway, that's when I switched. But nonetheless, in grad school, I was talking to him, and I was saying something about just, the typical Protestant idea of kind of the invisible unity or something like that. And which I think is still an important concept, but he really pushed back and said, yeah, don't forget the visible unity is very important. But people have eyes after all. They need to see people united, yeah. Right? And it's a really important point. So I've always kind of carried that, chewed on it, munched on it, thought about it for 14, 15 years since then. So I have a heart to do that. And yet when we actually get into the sources, as you say, when we read Calvin, when we read Luther, we read Augustine, when we read Clement or whatever, you begin to really, well, this is my opinion, you begin to see that there's a lot of differences, right? And there's not a golden age really where everybody's like in harmony and agreement. There's not, the church itself is just so different through the years even, right? And as we were talking about the difference between Calvin and Luther and Augustine, and even within differences within the Reformed tradition, right? All these differences. And how do we make sense of that? And I especially if you have an ecumenical spirit, you want to bring people together, from the Eastern traditions, Roman Catholicism to Protestantism, whatever, try to figure out a way to bring us all together. And I'm trying to think, how are ways to do that? How can we look at these guys, these leaders in the church in the past, and appreciate when they are wrong, appreciate when they are right, and still feel like we're living in harmony with them, such that a Calvinist today could appreciate certain non-Calvinist things in the earlier church or whatever, and vice versa, whatever. How do we do that? And one thought, and just toss it out, is I guess just to come back to the realization that these people are interpreters of Scripture, and as interpreters of Scripture, they have their own baggage, they have their own lenses they're reading through, and there's that within all interpretive acts, there's contingency, and we always interpret in light and for our situations, right? And so when we look at these fathers or reformers or whatever, I think perhaps one way we can still seek harmony with them, and even harmony horizontally today with those of other traditions, is just to kind of understand human finitude, our own situatedness, and how that influences our differences of opinions. You can't escape situatedness, right? You can't escape your situation. You're always in a situation, a life situation. You've got history. Hans Gadamer, the hermeneutics guy, he said that history does not belong to us. We belong to it. And I think that's powerful. And by history means something thick there. We belong to our traditions, and we always interpret in light of them and so forth. And so I don't know, is that a good category in which to think about even the ecumenical ideas, that if I were to disagree with you, for example, maybe the point of our disagreement is largely due to us answering different questions because we're in different situations. I don't know. Does any of that make sense?
No, it sounds crazy.
Okay.
I don't want anything to do with you. I'm never coming on here ever again. No,
as the agent of Satan, I guess I should say crazy.
No, I think that's great, because I think that there's instances where if you want to take Luther as an example, you could go and say, does going and not just tossing out the Catholics, but tossing out the Zwinglians and the Anabaptists and kind of everybody else, and saying, hey, they're all confused and don't know anything, and they're all false apostles. Is that something that I would go and say in my context? Well, probably not. But I'm also like, I don't hear Tetzel sort of ringing in my ears as well, and I don't have the I'm not in a context where the idea of almsgiving going and, you know, propitiating God for the sins of my family members or my own sins or something is a real thing that could potentially be, you know, be abused, that I could go and make use of it, that people would go and make use of, the church could potentially go and use its own authority in an improper way to go and, you know, to take advantage of people. Those, I mean, that's not what either of us are, you know, are reacting against. And so I think that going and recognizing the situatedness that we all have and with our, you know, with our own theology is really valuable and helpful, and can help us to read sources in the most charitable and, I think, constructive way. I will say that I think that at a basic level, if you do not believe in the authority of the early church, which is not to say that there's an independent authority of the early church, but if you don't believe that God was guiding the early church in some, you know, some kind of normative way for us, Christianity is something that deconstructs. Christianity is something that deconstructs. Even somebody who is going to say, well, I don't need the creed, I don't need anything, just go and give me the Bible. You will find that the canon of scripture will deconstruct when you really start to ask questions, you know, pretty seriously. The Bible will go and start to slip through your fingers as well, both with respect to the, you know, the canon itself, and then, you know, any sort of trustworthiness on the church's preservation of the text. And you can go and see, you know, people who, you know, kind of, you know, Bar Ehrman types who have had a more radical kind of suspicion towards tradition, stuff like that, and then that goes and ends up turning against the Bible itself once you go and you start asking questions, kind of consistency. So if you don't believe that the early church, that there's something that is distinct in the way that God is acting through that's meant to be an example for us, and in the way that Calvin really goes and says, you know, to saddle it, if you don't hold to that, then you will find that the Christianity itself will go and deconstruct. And you can see that even in some of the more radical things that Luther does, and, you know, making a 23 book New Testament canon instead of a 27 book New Testament canon, for example. It's like, you can see, it's like, wow, this seems inherently unstable to go into, you know, to be subjectively kind of taking certain, you know, books out of the New Testament. That seems like that could be problematic. And conversely, I think that if you do think that you know, God is guiding at least the early church, and wherever you want to stop that, there's different people who have different positions. And growing up, I was in a lot of different contexts with different people, have different views on this. Some people think, you know, Constantine is the great Satan. He is the Matt Halstead equivalent of his generation. Or, you know, whatever happens to be, if you follow Calvin and say, you know, up to, you know, Gregory the Great, or, you know, the kind of first 500 years, but whatever it is, if you do recognize that there is that God is working through, I mean, through Christ, through the apostles, and then through those that they went and discipled, who then went to continue to disciple the people around them, to really transform the world and the ancient world from what was a pretty nasty and brutal place into the world that, you know, we know today. And we recognize that there is you know, a normativity to what God is doing there. Then I think going back to those sources and letting those sources go and teach us, and letting those sources provide a basis for unity for us, is not just something that is desirable or not something that's a good idea. I think it's something, I mean, my sense is, I think it's something that's incumbent upon us. I think if we go and we take the canon of scripture as normative, if we take the particular reading tradition of the early church and say, this is God-given, God is working in a normative way through the church to provide this for all believers, for the transformation of the world. And if we believe that with some of the creeds and councils, etc., then it seems inconsistent that we would go and ignore these readers when it comes to, well, what do these texts actually say?
Mm.
what do these things actually mean? And I mean, we honestly, for most of us, we don't even get to the point of disagreeing with them as, you know, as readers of these texts. We just completely ignore them. And that to me seems inconsistent. It seems inconsistent. And I think that part of holding to a high view of scripture and a high view of scripture as revelation, I think that going along with that naturally is a sense that, okay, the people that God gave the scriptures to, God is acting normatively through them. Which doesn't mean that we have no critical thinking hats. It doesn't mean that there's nothing that God is calling us to do in our own age that, you know, might not be identical to what they were doing in our own age, or sorry, in their age, you know, et cetera. But I think it does mean that we're meant to go and to sit at the feet of the doctors of the church, and and in a period where you do have, you know, if you're thinking, you know, pre-Great Schism, pre-whatever, even if you're saying pre-Constantine or whatever, well, then go and like take that seriously and examine, you know, the practices, examine the beliefs, examine, you know, the theology and the lifestyle of the believers of this period, and really let them speak to you and challenge you, because if what they did was good enough to go and to take, you know, the Roman Empire and, you know, what seemed like this pretty brutal, just, you know, ancient world, and was able to go and to completely transform it from the inside out, then boy, it seems like there's a pretty good chance that they might have something to say in my own life as well, when my own life starts to look a little bit like that Roman Empire. You know what I mean? And when our world around us can start to look somewhat similar as well. I think that so that's what I would say. And I don't think that is that, to me, I don't think that this is a kind of improper nostalgia. I think that some people, you know, can kind of say, oh, well, you're kind of chasing after this lost unity that wasn't there or whatever. I'd say, you know, there's no real kind of, you know, area where things are better than I know, but well, you don't really know that until you go and look, do you? And most people who I hear that from, they don't have a clue of any age besides their own. They just have no clue. No. It's kind of like, you know, and I mean, if you look in any other era of any, I mean, any completely secular, you know, things. If you look at like eras of architecture, you think, oh, well, this is the greatest era. There's never been a golden age. Well, if you actually look at any other kind of building and other, you know, periods, and say, there's real golden ages. It was like, if we go back to this, we could really learn some stuff. If you're thinking, you know, in music, if you like, you know, into classical music, stuff like that, you can think, oh, this is the greatest. There's never been anything better than what me and my friends are doing right now on our banjos or whatever. But if you really take this seriously, say, no, there are golden ages of classical music where it's like, no, there is some kind of genius that's here. And in being discipled by this, there's so much more that's possible than if it's just kind of us going and making stuff up. You know, on our banjos. And I think that the same principle holds true in theology. And yeah, I think that we, at least for mine, you know, having an opportunity to read and study more deeply in these other periods, seeing the fruit that was born in my life. You know, it's the kind of stuff that I want for everybody, because it really is, you know, transformative and really. It's really enriching. So
it's awesome. Okay, yeah. So last question. Okay, so we've talked a lot about all sorts of stuff, heady theological stuff. We've traveled back in time several times over. So this is a very important question, though. You're probably going to kind of caught off guard on this, but what does it mean to follow Jesus?
What does it mean to follow Jesus?
What does it mean to follow Jesus? Like, we've talked about justification being in right relationship with God and everything like that. But for those listening who, you know, may or may not be that interested in everything that we've talked about, I think they're probably all interested in that question. Like, what do you, yeah. What does it mean to follow Jesus?
Yeah. You know, I think the challenge the challenge with thinking of the question in those terms is that we, in our contemporary context, have a tendency to try to boil things down to, hey, this is one thing. Just give us the one thing. This is just give us the easy answer. So this is, I've already boiled it down to just following Jesus. That's what I do. I boiled Christianity down to that thing. And then if you can go and give me the boiled down version of what it means to go and to do the thing that I've boiled everything down to, then that'd be great. And I can go and take that home and do, put it in my pocket. Souvenir from this podcast extravaganza with the agent of Satan, Matthew Halstead. And I honestly, if I'm putting myself in a position of, if I'm thinking of like, the early fathers, I'm thinking of, people like Justin or Irenaeus or, kind of fill in the blank. And I'm thinking, how is it that they would go and answer a question like this? I think that they would almost object to the question itself and saying, can you go and boil everything that God is, everything that God has done in Christ down to one thing? Because it is all encompassing. And even if you're going to go and boil it down to following Jesus, it is something that is all encompassing, that goes and requires, every piece of us, every piece of our life, and that's both in a private sense, but then also in a public sense, and also when it comes to the actual public life of the church, and the way that the life of the church goes and engages and transforms those inside it, and then the world outside it as well. It is this all-encompassing thing. The faith that the apostles went and gave us, that you see kind of take root within the ancient world, is something that's so, it's one of the things that's interesting. If you look in some of the sources within the book, the Apology of Aristides and the Epistle to Diognetus, which my view, this is probably the Apology of Quadratus. So so early, say like 125 AD, sometime around there. The following Jesus is something which is so distinctive and so weird to the outside world that they describe Christians as a different race of people. And so you have this, what it looks to outsider eyes like the same way that you have Jews, and you've got Greeks, and you've got those other things. It's so all encompassing that you see this, like, you almost have to call them a different race, but then they don't really work as a race, because they're a race that is comprised of all these other races that go and do all these other things that these other races. It's just it's the outside world in this particular period does not have a particularly good way of categorizing this and saying, like, hey, this goes and fits into how we understand the world to work. It kind of breaks all those things. If I was to say, like, sort of one thing that I think is really fun, let me grab this for you, because I think you'll enjoy this. This is a classic text, which is, sorry, I'm just pulling this out for you here. This is from that same document, the Epistle to Diognetus. And it goes and it sums up for the audience, which Diognetus seems to be a figure of some standing, and a lot of people think this is actually talking about the Emperor Hadrian. And he goes and says, okay, well, what is it that Christians do? So if they're not Greeks, if they're not Jews, how would you describe who these people are, what they're like? So here, this is from the chapter 5 of the Epistle to Diognetus. I'll just go and I'll read this for you. It's a classic and just fantastic text. So, for Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country, language, or custom. For nowhere do they live in cities of their own, nor do they speak some unusual dialect, nor do they practice an eccentric way of life. This teaching of theirs has not been discovered by the thought of indigenous people, nor do they promote any human doctrine, as some do. But while they live in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot was cast, and follow the local customs in dress and food and other aspects of life, at the same time, they demonstrate their remarkable and admittedly unusual character of their own citizenship. They live in their own countries, but only as non-residents. They participate in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign country is their fatherland, and every fatherland is foreign. They marry like everyone else, and they have children. They do not expose their offspring. They share their food, but not their wives. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws. Indeed, in their private lives, they transcend the laws. They love everyone, and by everyone, they are persecuted. They are unknown, yet they are condemned. They are put to death, yet they are brought to life. They are dishonored, yet they are glorified in their dishonor. They're slandered, yet they are vindicated. They are cursed, yet they bless. They are insulted, yet they offer respect. When they do good, they are punished as evildoers. When they are punished, they rejoice as though brought to life. By the Jews, they are assaulted as foreigners. By the Greeks, they are persecuted. Yet those who hate them are unable to give a reason for their hostility. It's a great little passage. So if you want one thing to follow Jesus, there you go. There's your one thing. After all of my objections, Diagnosis 5 is what it means to follow Jesus.
Yeah, and in that text, it mentions a lot more than just one thing, which really captures your point, right? Really captures your point. That's so good. I think that's, man, I'm gonna have to like go back and watch this last segment over and over again because it's so good. I'm really glad I asked that question because I was thinking that's kind of a Sunday school question. But I'm really glad I did because that was an enriching answer. I appreciate that so much.
No, it is a good question. I'm glad you asked it. And if it encourages you to go back and read the Epistle to Agnetus, I find it really challenging and just really encouraging text. So go for it. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Well, man, I appreciate your time. I'm so thankful for your book and your work. And for those who have yet to read the book, here it is. This is what it looks like. That's a picture on the book of Matthew before he shaved. So anyway, anyway, check out the book. It's amazing. Zondervan, right? No, IVP. Sorry.
Yeah.
IVP.
I won't tell the IVP people
okay.
You said that.
Sorry. All right. Well, hey man, thanks for hanging out, and always fun to get to chat with you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.